Hello, everybody. You're listening to the Midwest Archaeology Podcast, or MAP for short. My name is Lee, and I'm joined with my co-host.
Hi, my name's Amanda, and welcome to MAP.
Yes, this is the first episode. We're really excited. We are education programming managers at a nonprofit called the Archaeological Research Institute.
And so at ARI, with our specific position, our goal is to educate everybody on archaeology. And so how we go about doing that is taking archaeology and making it digestible for people who aren't trained in it. And one of our mission statements at ARI is that archaeology is for everyone. And so we're using the podcast as a way to communicate information to anybody who might come across it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to make this approachable, non-pretentious, something that I would say archaeology, the really interesting stuff, that's what they struggle with is it's kind of inaccessible and very heady and steeped in esoteric words that no one understands. So we're trying to make this topic more approachable for people that are interested. So yeah. The podcast that we are going to be producing will focus and cover topics that relate on the archaeological record of the Ohio River Valley and the Midwest more broadly. So we are going to focus initially, at least, on the Ohio River Valley, but as we become more aware of topics and research, we'll probably broaden the scope.
Yep. So as we grow, the podcast will grow.
So yeah, in this episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about terminology. So just some of the terms that we use. There's more to say about all of this stuff, and we might cover more in a future episode. But for now, we're just going to talk briefly about terminology. And then in the second half of the podcast, we're going to be going into a very brief overview of the timeline of human settlement and activity in the Americas before European settlers arrived.
And before we get into everything at ARI, we are focused on the identification, preservation, and responsible scientific exploration of archaeological sites in the tri-state area of the greater Cincinnati area. And the tri-state area refers to Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, if you're not familiar as to where Cincinnati is.
Yep. So that's just a little bit about ARI, where we work. It's a pretty cool place. So let's get into it. Amanda, how long have humans been living in the Western Hemisphere?
So humans have been living in the Western Hemisphere for thousands and thousands of years. Researchers have many different theories about when humans first arrived in the Americas. The dates range from about 19,000 years ago all the way to 40,000 years ago. The process by which humans come to span North and South America is known as the peopling of the Americas. We do plan on covering that peopling in a future episode because there's a lot of different theories and then different ways of doing research that have come to the forefront during this. Yeah.
I would say when it comes to cutting edge, new discoveries, this peopling of the Americas is where some of the most exciting stuff is.
And mostly because archaeology of the Midwest has been under-researched for
Absolutely,
a while.
Yeah.
So multiple different reasons as to why that is. But if we get into that, we were going to be here for a while, and we've got other things to cover.
But the main takeaway is that all you guys need to know, humans have been in the North American continent and South American continent. That's beyond our purview. For 19,000 years ago, all the way to 40,000 years ago. And it's possible that it could be longer than that.
Yeah. And the reason why the date keeps getting pushed back is because science is the process of finding the truth. And as we get more information, that truth changes. And so a lot of these dates that we're throwing out here are not hard and fast. They are soft and they're open to being changed.
Yep, absolutely. So when we're talking about this time before European settlers arrived, historically, people have used the term prehistoric to refer to that time as though, well, the traditional definition of prehistory is the time before writing. But the reason we try to avoid using that term in this context is that it implies that this whole timeline stretching back possibly tens of thousands of years was just not really important, and history just
didn't happen.
Began when European settlers arrived. So we try and refer to the time before European settlers as simply pre-contact. There's also some other terms, pre-Columbian, pre-colonial, but we're going to probably just use pre-contact.
Yeah, we will just be using the term pre-contact, but if you hear those other terms, you now know what they're referring to
Yeah.
if they don't explain it.
So when it comes to studying pre-contact communities, it's important to stress that there's a lot that we won't be able to find out about them as much as we might want to. And that's simply because of the fragility of the material record.
Right.
So when it comes to the Ohio River Valley, there's some factors that make it really hard to preserve context, which is really important for archaeologists. So what are some of the things that make it challenging to do archaeology in the Ohio River Valley?
So as we mentioned before, when people say prehistory, they're referring to a time before writing. And so individuals who lived during the time before contact, they didn't have written records because that's not how they chose to preserve their history and things like that. At this time, indigenous communities were more focused on transmitting their history and their culture through oral traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you've probably learned about that in school, but if not, we can get into some more examples of what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Really, just think about it when you're at Christmas and all of a sudden, like, one of your relatives, like, wants to tell this story about one of your parents, and you're like, wow, I've never heard this story before. What's going on? It's similar to that, where it's storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be as serious as passing down a religious story, or it can be as, did you know that your dad accidentally shoplifted when he was 5 years old? You know? So, because these people...
Or that there was some natural disaster that happened. So in addition to that, the archaeology that we do in this area is hard because we're right next to the Ohio River. So we are excavating in floodplains, which, as the name would suggest, regularly floods. So it mixes up the context. And also, this is basically mostly agricultural land. And if it's not agricultural land, it's, highways or factories. So there's been a lot of destruction of context. And archaeologists love to preserve as much context as possible because that's where you can really tease out the bigger picture of their life.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot to work with, but context is really important for that reason.
So to define context refers to the exact spot where an artifact is found. While artifacts might not be found in the last spot they were placed or left, it's important to keep a clear and accurate record of where it was found. So if an artifact was moved due to flooding or agriculture or construction, we might not have that original context as to where it came from, but we can learn from where we found it. So the way I kind of like to think of it like a grocery store locator. This is an example.
This is interesting. No, I like this. I haven't heard this before, though.
Yeah, so like dairy aisle isn't super specific, but say like G1, because you can look up on the sign and go, G1. Sometimes the dairy aisle is marked, I know, but dairy aisle versus G1, there's a difference in how specific they're labeled. So
absolutely, because G1 by itself doesn't really make much sense. But in the greater context of there's an A1, there's a B1, there's a C1, you can kind of put it, you can conceptualize where it belongs in the store.
Yeah. So if we're thinking of this in archaeological terms, let's say we find an artifact in one of our STPs or our units, which an STP is a shovel test pit, and that's a surveying method.
Love an STP.
We do love a good STP, guys. But we use a surveying methods to figure out where we're going to put those big 1x1 squares.
Units. That we like to, that's what we refer to them as.
Yeah. And those are probably the types of holes you're more familiar with. That's usually what the pictures show in the media. But let's say we find an artifact in STP A5. That's more specific than, just that hole over there. So.
Absolutely. So before we get into the timeline, I think something that I want to talk about is the scope that we mainly study at ARI when it comes to pre-contact communities. They are mainly in the late pre-contact, and then they're also in the woodland period. Humans have, I will explain all of those things momentarily.
Fear not, guys. You will get
a
year to put with that.
But with that being said, humans have been in the Ohio River Valley and the Midwest more generally from the very earliest period of human inhabitation of North America, which is called the Paleo period. So there is the whole breadth of the timeline that can be found in the Ohio River Valley. So yeah.
Yep. And before we get into that, I do want to say that Lee and I are just relaying information that's already been discovered and reported. And we are not perfect narrators because we're human.
Yes.
And then also, if we're thinking about modern day descendant communities of these indigenous people, they are the best narrators for what life is like for them now. So do seek out content from indigenous peoples.
We are absolutely planning on centering indigenous voices. We're also going to be talking to some indigenous researchers, some people about some indigenous communicators as well. There's some people that really love to talk about it. And so we're definitely really excited to talk to them.
Yes.
So with that being said, we're going to go to a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get into the timeline from the Paleo to the late pre-contact. We can broadly divide pre-contact history into loose and somewhat ill-fitting periods. Imperfect though they might be, it's important to use these period names when we're talking about this because it's important to conceptualize the past and kind of organize it by trends and what we see in the material record. Also, the environment and just climate in general is a big, you guys will see it's a big dividing line between some of these periods. They're not a one size fits all kind of situation. So each region, a period might last a little bit longer than another one. America is a huge country.
So, and then another part of the reason why we do have periods, why we have separate, people like labels.
People like labels.
It's easier for us to understand. But then there is change. And so we do need to make sure that we signify that change.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just say one long time.
Yeah.
So with that being said, what's the first period?
So we've got the Paleo period. So that's from when humans arrived to about 8,000 BCE, so before Common Era. The Paleo period refers to the earliest well-attested evidence of humans in North America. So these humans were living in the last few days of the Ice Age.
I think when they came across, there were still glaciers like in the Midwest.
Yeah.
They were in the process of retreating northwards.
Yes. So the scientific name for this period is the Pleistocene. So think mammoths.
So mammoths. There was also a North American horse.
Oh, there was a North American horse.
Yeah, and actually the horse evolved in North America and then spread out.
Yep.
Or the lands that would become North America.
Yes.
So the first people that arrived in our neck of the woods, in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, came around 13,000 years ago. And they arrived at the end again of the Pleistocene when the Wisconsin Glacier retreated across the Midwest.
So they were thought to be in small groups of hunter-gatherers that sometimes hunted now extinct large animals, which we refer to those as megafauna. The degree to which these hunters contributed to the extinction of the megafaunal species is disputed, but
some people, I think from what I have been reading, it's indisputable that humans played an effect. They definitely hunted these megafaunal species, but also these other, like the horses weren't huge. They were just normal sized horses from what I understand.
Horses are large though.
Yeah, but I don't know if they'd be considered megafauna.
I don't think so.
Probably not.
Yeah. But also I want to make sure we keep this in mind. All of these people from this, they were figuring everything out.
Yeah.
They didn't have
they had good, but they also had good reasons to focus on food. Yeah. So anyway, people think that they played a small part. Some people think they played a large part. All we know is that as soon as humans show up, there are certain species that go extinct.
Yes.
So correlation does not always
equal
causation, but a lot of people think of that. Yes. So the next period that we cover, and again, I will give you guys some dates, but it's very loose. You could give or take a few hundred years. So the next period is called the Archaic, and it goes from 8,000 BCE to around 1,000 BCE. So what separates the Paleo period from the Archaic, as I was saying earlier, is the changing temperature of North America as a whole. Really globally, it just got warmer, and that's a trend that exists up to this day. Earth is just getting warmer.
Yep.
So in addition to the changing climate, we also mentioned that the extinction of the species that we just talked about affected the ecosystems quite a lot, because those species had been in North America. That's where they evolved. So they'd been there for a really long time. With the warmer climates, however, more hunting and gathering opportunities arose across the Midwest. And even human populations are thought to actually have increased at the beginning of this period, which you'd think with all of those animals going extinct, that was their bread and butter. That was how they got their food. You'd think that there might be a decrease in population, but with warmer climates, there was more opportunity.
Yep. So while the early Archaic materially appears to be very similar to the material record of the Paleo period, significant changes in lifestyle can also be noted as time goes on. This period is defined by the growing sophistication of hunting tools and strategies. There are significant changes to the tools that humans used. And as a whole, human populations are thought to have increased and become less mobile in the Paleo period. So we're seeing more of settling down.
They're not quite sedentary yet,
Yeah.
but they are becoming less mobile. So they were, for our neck of the woods, people would just probably hang around the Midwest as opposed to following really, really far off
Instead
migration patterns.
Yeah,
or
going from coast to coast or up and down the coast they're on.
They're
Just hanging out in a more condensed area. Because of this, the regionally based groups of humans began to develop a distinctive material culture that differs from their neighbors.
Which is really interesting to think about.
Yeah.
It makes sense. People just stay in one spot as opposed to going off all over the place. They start to there's less contact. I mean, there's still contact with their neighbors, but it's less.
Yes.
And so they become a little bit different, a little bit quirkier.
Yeah. And
than their neighbors.
Think of it like someone who's settling in modern day Washington State versus modern day Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Their climate's different. They've got different resources available to them. So, of course, their material record's going to look a bit different from each other, despite being there at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. And it is during the Archaic that the first evidence of ceremonial barriers emerges during this time. Not quite the mounds of the later time periods, but it does seem that burials are becoming more important.
Yep. And so the evidence that leads us to this conclusion is people are being buried with items.
Yeah.
We call those grave goods. And those are very culturally significant. So you can think jewelry, you can think tools, anything that might indicate what this person was doing when they were alive.
Absolutely. And at the end of this period, there is evidence of semi-sedentary villages, plant cultivation, and ceramic production. So at the end of this time, things are really starting to warm up when it comes to the stuff that they're trying to do.
Right.
So that leads us to our next period.
Yep. So the next period is the Woodland period, which spans from about 1000 BCE to 1000 CE. So
2,000 years.
Yeah. So before Common Era and then into our Common Era. So the Woodland period is traditionally defined by the emergence of the widespread use of pottery, some of which were decorated by impressing cord or fabric into the clay. So when the clay is wet, they're taking something and pressing it into it to leave a pattern.
Yep. We mentioned in the late Archaic that people started doing ritual burials. So this trend continued into the Woodland. So the burial ritualism of the previous Archaic period was built upon during the Woodland period. And this culminates in what this area is probably known best for, which are the mounds. So again, if you know anything about North American, Midwestern pre-contact, anything about the Midwest, you probably are aware of these mounds. So we kind of broke up the Woodland period into 3 smaller periods. So the first one is the early Woodland, and that starts from around 1000 BCE to 100 BCE. And as we just mentioned, these mounds, this is when they start popping up. So the first people that started to build mounds were a part of what we refer to as the Adena culture. And this is in the Ohio River Valley. They were building earthwork mounds. The Adena get their name, if any of you guys were curious, They get their name from the Adena Mound, which is a mound found on the property of a fella who named his mansion the Adena Mansion in Chillicothe, Ohio. So it's from a European settler. That's how we got that name.
And that's pretty common in archaeology, is when we don't have a name to refer to a certain group of people, as in we're unsure of what they called themselves, we normally just name the site after the land.
Yeah, pretty much.
So we steward and preserve a site called Guard, and we call it the Guard Village because it's on the land of the Guard family.
Yep. But as we were saying earlier in the episode, there is no written record for these people. So we don't know what they called themselves. So we have to call them something. So that's...
because we as people like to label things.
Yeah.
And there's also no evidence that every single group of people had a name to refer to themselves.
Yeah, that's true.
So
you only need a name for yourself if there's other people that you are in contact with that is not a part of your group.
Right. If you need to other yourself or someone else, that's usually when a name comes into play. Which is
interesting.
Yes.
So in addition to these mounds that the Adena were building, exotic raw materials have popped up at these sites. So they are thought to be sourced from other parts of the continent. They're found in greater abundance during this time, the early woodlands. So we'll get more into it. This is kind of when long distance trade is starting to happen. It's not as sophisticated as it will be in later periods, but that's when, mound building and trade is picking up.
Yep. So they're starting these things, which will only grow.
Yes.
Yes. So now we're getting into the Middle Woodland period, which spans from about 100 BCE before Common Era and then into 400 CE, which is the Common Era. So during the Middle Woodland period, a group known as the Ohio Hopewell became prominent in the Ohio Valley. Hopewell people got their name from a family that owned the property on which there were some large mounds.
And that was when the Hopewell was first beginning to be documented.
Right.
So this was, again, like we said, that's how these people normally get their names. So
the Hopewell were excellent farmers. They were starting to set up some systems in place in terms of farming.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think, so before we get back into the mound building, we should just mention that this was the time where people were starting to domesticate plants.
Right.
We were seeing a lot of, I don't believe maize had made its way north up from Mexico at this point, but there were other...
At least not in the Ohio River Valley.
At least not in the Ohio River Valley, because that is indicative of the next period.
Right, yeah. So the Hopewell were mound builders on a colossal scale and are responsible for the Portsmouth and then the Newark earthworks. In addition to these large earthen mounds, evidence of long-distance trade can be found at Ohio Hopewell sites. Materials such as copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from southern Atlantic coast, and mica from the southern Appalachian Mountains are common sites at Hopewell archaeological sites.
It's really cool to see because a lot of these raw materials were transported in an unprocessed way. So you just get like raw copper, and then they did stuff to it locally to make it, for local tastes, basically.
Right. So. And they even did that when they were making stone tools, which the official archaeological term for that is lithics. But an individual would go out and just find what we call a core. So think a giant, 20-pound chunk of chert or a different type of stone.
Mainly chert, though.
Mainly chert in this area. And they would just sit where they found it and kind of break it down so they can transport smaller parts back, or they would sit there and they would just make a bunch of tools and they would just take the tools back. So trade routes are sometimes indicative of that. They would just bring the giant core or whatever material they were bringing.
So something about the Middle Woodland is that this is kind of the quote-unquote golden age of the Ohio Hopewell. So this is when they were, again, building these huge earthworks that required a ton of labor, a ton of resources. They were very sophisticated. There's evidence of their rituals. We'll definitely get into it in future episodes. But again, this is just kind of like a survey. We're going through very briefly through the timeline. So that brings us to the last part of the woodland, which is referred to as the late woodland period. And that's going to be from around 400 CE to around 1000. So the late woodland is characterized by the end of the Hopewell as it existed in the archaeological record up to this point. There's a lot of theories about why the Hopewell tradition died out, but we're not going to go into that in this episode. We might cover it in a future episode. maybe not. There's been a lot of back and forth about this. This is also a subject that is the topic of very hot debates,
Right.
passionate debates. So these large earthworks that we mentioned in the middle woodland, they stopped being built. So evidence of in addition to the earthworks ceasing to be built, large scale trading networks that we sometimes refer to as the Hopewellian interaction sphere began to decrease in the material record. So that interaction sphere is kind of what we were talking about with that long distance trade. So the copper from the Great Lakes, mica, and all of that stuff, that still is found, but it's in lesser quantities.
Right. We're also seeing evidence of the bow and arrow during this period.
Very cool.
Which before the bow and arrow, we had this wonderful, beautiful
I wonder what they use.
Called an addle, which is an Aztec word for spear thrower. But
Aztec Nahuatl.
Yes. The train stops there on that because we will be getting into that
in
a future episode. And no spoilers
here. A real rabbit hole to go down.
And they are
also that's something to look forward to.
Very fun to use. Lee and I are well versed
in
throwing.
I would say I'm better at you.
You are. You throw farther.
That's true.
But
yes. Maybe not necessarily.
Accurate.
Yes. Okay. That's
You've
a good
got
point.
Distance. I've got accuracy.
Okay. So the next period.
The next period is the late pre-contact period, which spans from about 1000 CE to 1600 CE.
It ends when when the Europeans show up, basically.
Yes. So following the dispersal of the Hopewell tradition, the next period is referred to as the late pre-contact age. It is during the late pre-contact period that humans begin to transition into more sedentary lifestyles, increase their dependency on maize as a primary crop, and innovate and change their ritual practices. So think of this kind of as the suburbs, if you will, or a rural area.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because we're seeing people settle in and settle down.
Yeah. They basically, some communities of these people ate only maize, or at least that was their primary diet.
Right.
And something that we can see evidence of is their diet just tanked in terms of nutritional value. And so there's evidence that they just were way less healthy than the people that came before. So we need a name for the people of this time period. What are they called?
So we refer to these people as the Fort Ancient people. The Fort Ancient people get their name from the Fort Ancient site, which we now know is actually a Hopewell site in terms of years. But
so it's a little bit confusing. Just know that the Fort Ancient site is actually a Hopewell site. But at the time, people thought that this was
an ancient fort.
An ancient fort, which how they got their name, but it stuck, so that's just how we refer to it.
Right.
The Fort Ancient are the people after the Hopewell.
Yes.
That's the main takeaway.
Yeah. So the late pre-contact period is sometimes referred to as the Mississippian period. The reason this time is sometimes referred to as the Mississippian period is due to the increase in cultural and commercial influence that societies based around the Mississippi River had on the communities in the Ohio River Valley. But we try not to use Mississippian when referring to the period, because there's the Mississippian culture, which are a people who were alive during this time.
Yep.
And it's not accurate to refer to the entire period as Mississippian if we're just going to be talking about a specific group of people. Hence why we're referring to it as the late pre-contact period.
I feel like something comparable to it would be like the Hellenistic period.
Right.
So it's not that all of the countries of the Near East and the Middle East were Greek, but they were had Greek elements start to show up. And so it's kind of like a similar, it wouldn't be right to call that period the Greek period or the Macedonian period.
Right.
It's the Hellenistic. With that being said, there's a reason why it's referred to as the Mississippian period. And that's because there's a lot of cultural and commercial links between the Fort Ancient people and more Western Mississippian sites such as Cahokia.
Yes. So we're not trying to say that the Mississippian people didn't exist. We're just saying that referring to the entire period and to them as both Mississippian is confusing.
Yep.
So we're going to be referring to it as the late pre-contact period, which is a mouthful, but it's a more correct way of referring to the period.
Absolutely. So in addition to all of that, there's another thing that this period is known for with the increase of sedentary lifestyle. There's also a trend where people who are more settled tend to be more warlike.
They have something to defend.
They've got property. So this period, there are more examples increase in evidence of conflict and warfare. So at Guard, there's a palisade. It's thought that it may not have been defensive in nature,
Right.
but it may have been designated. But at other sites, it really does look like it's some sort of defensive structure.
Mhm.
So that is a characteristic of Fort Ancient sites.
Right. And there's plenty of reasons as to why people go to war. And so, again, not one size fits all.
Yeah, absolutely. So the mound building that had started with the Adena, then the Hopewell, and now the Fort Ancient continued actually. And it was the Fort Ancient that built, or at least contributed to, the serpent and alligator mounds that are really famous in Ohio.
And they're named those because they're in the shape of those. So the serpent mound is in the shape of a snake, and then the alligator mounds are in the shape of an alligator. So the end of the late pre-contact period is generally marked by the appearance of European trade goods approximately around the early 1600s.
Yep. And that, as soon as there may not have been European settlers that were in that region settling, but as soon as you see like a musket ball or some beads, some European manufactured beads, that's when contact ends. And I don't think we mentioned it, but the Fort Ancient are thought to be the ancestors of modern day tribes. So the Miami, the Shawnee, the Peoria, and the Kickapoo, and there's others.
The Osage.
So all of those peoples are thought to be descendants of the Fort Ancient people, because they didn't just disappear. They continued up until Europeans started settling in this area.
Yep.
So
before we wrap up, we wanted to make sure that we highlight a land acknowledgement.
We recognize that the land we study and steward is the homeland of many peoples. We acknowledge the Miami, Shawnee, Peoria, Kickapoo, Osage, and the multitude of nations who call this their homelands.
So
that actually concludes our first episode. So thank you for listening to the first episode. If you're interested to learn more about these subjects, please visit our website and stay tuned for the next episode. Right. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening.